Life isn't always a choice, it's a series of lessons we're required to learn, whether we like it or not. In this video, we're diving deep into 10 powerful life lessons that keep showing up until we finally get them right. Get ready to uncover the truths that could change everything. Topic 1. The illusion of unluckiness. The morning started like the rest, gray, rushed, and strangely heavy. Coffee spilled on his shirt before the interview, his phone died mid-call with the recruiter, and by 4 p.m., the email he was dreading finally arrived. We've decided to move forward with another candidate. Again. Later that evening, he sat alone in a quiet bar that smelled like yesterday's rain and burnt toast. Another rejection, another breakup, another month behind on rent. His eyes scanned the room, searching for anything, anyone, to blame. The city, the system, his ex, his boss, his parents, God, himself, but only for a fleeting second, before he pushed the thought away. It's just bad luck, he muttered under his breath, as if convincing himself. He had mastered the art of external blame. Failed jobs were always because of office politics, failed relationships because they couldn't handle a real man, and his string of broken friendships, well, people just weren't loyal anymore. But then his phone buzzed back to life with a single voicemail notification. Unknown number. He pressed play. You missed the lesson. Again. No name. No context. Just those 6 words, delivered in a calm, steady voice that didn't sound familiar, but felt disturbingly intimate. His heart thudded. The world around him didn't pause, but something inside him did. For the first time in a long time, the thought whispered back louder than the excuses. What if none of this is random? What if he wasn't cursed, but clueless? Topic 2. The echoes that follow. Days passed, but that voicemail echoed louder than silence. You missed the lesson. Again. He tried to brush it off. Wrong number. Maybe a prank. But it followed him, into his new job, his next date, his restless dreams. At work, the faces changed, but the tension didn't. The new manager praised him in meetings, then dismissed his ideas behind closed doors. He stayed late again, hoping to prove himself. Again. The pattern was too familiar. Just enough hope to keep him hanging, just enough indifference to make him question his worth. His new relationship, promising, at first. Charming texts, deep conversations over wine. Then, without warning, she began pulling away. Late replies, cold distance. The same script in a new accent. One night, unable to sleep, he rummaged through an old box marked college stuff. Inside, mismatched photos, faded receipts, and a weathered journal he didn't remember keeping. He opened it. Page after page revealed rants about exes who weren't ready, bosses who never saw his potential, and so-called friends who betrayed him. Different names, same complaints, same wounds, same endings. And there it was, in his own handwriting, dated 7 years ago. Why does this always happen to me? The question burned now, not because it was naive, but because it hadn't changed. He hadn't changed. The faces were different. The jobs, cities, circumstances all reshuffled pieces on the same old board. And suddenly, a quiet but terrifying truth surfaced, one that rattled deeper than the voicemail. He was the common thread. Topic 3. The betrayal loop. He needed grounding. A voice that didn't feel like judgment. Someone who knew him before the spiral, before the excuses. So he called Maya. They'd been friends since college. She'd seen him through heartbreaks, layoffs, hangovers, and half-baked business ideas. If anyone could remind him who he was, it was her. They met at the same cafe they always used to, corner table, chipped mug, late afternoon light spilling across a worn notebook. She sat across from him, in silence as he vented. About work, his girlfriend, his life. Again, he spoke in circles. Words like, unfair, manipulated, taken advantage of. Maya didn't nod this time. She didn't console him. She just looked at him, really looked. Her eyes weren't cruel, but they weren't soft either. They were tired. Then she said it. You're addicted to pain. You just want to be right about being the victim. His breath caught in his throat. She didn't stop. You call it bad luck, but I call it self-sabotage. You chase the same people, the same jobs, the same patterns, because they confirm the story you refuse to rewrite. He laughed, sharply, defensively. What the hell does that mean? It means you choose the pain you know. Silence. Her voice didn't rise. Her face didn't flinch. And with that, she stood, leaving the untouched coffee and a history that had run out of patience. He sat there, hollowed out by the realization that maybe this wasn't betrayal. Maybe it was the first time someone had told him the truth. Topic 4. The mirror shatters. That night, something broke. Not a plate, not a door, something inside. He couldn't sleep, not with Maya's words ringing in his ears like a dare, You choose the pain you know. Restless. He wandered his apartment like a ghost, lights off, TV on mute, the city outside flickering through half-closed blinds. He looked around and saw a life built on default settings, clothes he didn't love, books he never read, motivational quotes taped to a wall that felt more like a lie than a hope. Drawn like a magnet, he found himself standing in the bathroom, gripping the edges of the sink. The mirror in front of him didn't offer comfort. It offered confrontation. He stared, really stared, for the first time in years. The man looking back was tired, yes, but worse, he looked unfamiliar, as if he'd aged 10 years in one. Eyes dimmed not by time, but by repetition. A face frozen between denial and regret. And for a moment, he whispered the truth out loud, just to see how it sounded. Maybe it's not them. Maybe it's me. He watched his reflection absorb the words like a confession. Then, as if answering a silent question, the memory of the voicemail returned, not the voice itself, but its message. You missed the lesson. Again. And suddenly, it clicked. Life wasn't punishing him. It was preparing him. The failures weren't chaos. They were curriculum. Every broken relationship, every dead-end job, every echo of rejection, all repeated chapters in an exam he refused to study for. And the mirror. It wasn't a reflection. It was a midterm. Topic 5. The test of accountability. The days that followed were quieter, but inside him, a storm was raging. He knew what he had to do, but it was the hardest thing he'd faced so far. Look back. Really look back. He pulled out old messages, emails, even text threads he'd deleted months ago. He revisited conversations with friends who had drifted away, relationships that ended in silence, jobs lost not to circumstance, but to his own mistakes. Each memory was a needle pricking his skin, each scene replayed with sharper clarity. He wasn't the wounded party in every story. Far from it. There were moments he'd lashed out, times he'd shut people out, days he chose anger over understanding, pride over apology. He saw it all now, his stubbornness, his selfishness, the lies he told himself to stay comfortable. The weight was suffocating, but it wasn't just guilt. It was revelation. No more blaming the world. No more hiding behind bad luck or wrong timing. The hardest part wasn't just seeing the damage. It was owning it. He drafted emails and sent apologies, rehearsed words he never said out loud. Sometimes he stared at his reflection and asked silently, "Can I forgive myself enough to change?" And slowly, amid the heaviness, a fragile hope took root. The lesson he'd missed so many times wasn't punishment, it was responsibility. For the first time, the possibility of freedom from his own mistakes whispered through the cracks. Topic 6. The love that broke him. It wasn't supposed to happen. Not today. Not now. But life, with its cruel sense of timing, sent her back. She walked into the coffee shop as if no time had passed. Yet everything between them had shifted, thick with unspoken words, unfinished stories, and ghosts neither dared confront. Their eyes met, hesitated, then settled into a fragile conversation. She looked at him, not with anger, but with a sorrow so deep it cut deeper than any fight. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you," she said quietly, voice trembling just enough to show the truth. "I left because you never showed up for your own life." The words landed like stones thrown into still water, rippling through the cracks he had buried deep inside. He swallowed hard, wanting to argue, to explain, to defend the version of himself he clung to, but the honesty in her eyes stopped him. The version of himself he'd hidden from. She continued, "I waited for you to fight, for you to want better, for you to choose you, but you were always somewhere else, lost in the same mistakes, the same pain, the same story." Silence stretched between them like a canyon. His chest tightened. For the first time, he wasn't the wounded victim. He was the reason. Her departure hadn't been a betrayal. It was a breaking point. And that truth, it haunted him long after she left. Topic 7. The father's letter. The discovery was accidental. He was clearing out the attic, a dusty sanctuary of forgotten memories, when an old, yellowed envelope slipped from a stack of faded newspapers. The handwriting was unmistakable, his father's. He hesitated, fingers trembling, before breaking the fragile seal. Inside was a letter, worn and creased, dated years before his father's death, words penned but never sent. The silence between those lines spoke volumes. "Son, if you are reading this, it means I never found the courage to say these things aloud." His breath caught as he read on. The letter spoke of pain, his father's own battles with disappointment and missed chances, lessons hard learned through scars he never showed. Pain is the cruelest teacher, but the most honest. It strips away lies until only truth remains. He wrote about discipline, not as punishment, but as the backbone of survival, the quiet strength in showing up even when everything inside screams to quit. "I failed you in many ways, but I hoped you'd learn before it was too late." The words pierced through years of distance and silence. unraveling the stubborn armor he had worn for so long. For the first time, the weight of legacy wasn't a burden to resist, it was a beacon. The father he'd thought unreachable was offering one final lesson, one last chance. And in the fading light of the attic, he felt something fragile begin to shift, a reckoning not just with the past, but with the man he could still become. Topic 8. The reckoning. He knew what had to be done. No more running, no more hiding behind silence or excuses. With the father's letter folded carefully in his pocket, he began to face the ghosts he'd avoided for years, friends he'd burnt, bosses he'd crossed, wounds he'd left open. He reached out first to those he'd hurt most, crafting messages that trembled with honesty, regret, and hope. Some answers came swiftly, others not at all. At the coffee shop, where Maya had once walked away, he met with people who once mattered. Conversations were awkward at first, heavy with things left unsaid, but slowly, the walls began to crack. For the first time, he wasn't begging for forgiveness. He wasn't pleading for peace. He was offering it. In one room, a former boss shook his head, refusing to accept the apology, her eyes cold but fair. In another, a friend embraced him, tears slipping down cheeks weathered by time. Each encounter was a test, some passed, some failed, but he showed up fully. The hardest part wasn't their judgment, it was his own. Learning to accept the uneven path of redemption, knowing that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt, some scars would remain. But for the first time, peace wasn't something to beg for, it was something he could earn. Topic 9. The final trial. Just as the pieces of his life began to settle, fate dealt a cruel hand. A loss so profound it threatened to unravel everything he'd fought to rebuild. An unexpected betrayal, a health scare, or the sudden departure of someone he had just started to trust. The world around him blurred. The old panic clawed at his chest, whispers of doubt flooding in. But this time, something was different. Instead of fleeing, he stood still. No frantic calls, no desperate pleas, no bitter regrets. He faced the storm like a man who'd walked through fire and come out hardened, not broken. The silence around him was deafening, and in that silence, he found clarity. The test was no longer about success or failure. It was about endurance. The lesson wasn't about avoiding pain, it was about standing firm in it. And for the first time, he passed. Topic 10. The man who emerged. The twist wasn't in the victories. It wasn't in the apologies accepted, or the relationships mended, or the trials endured. It was in the man himself. He realized that life never promised a perfect ending, only a relentless process. The lessons weren't about fixing the world, or bending it to his will. They were about forging a self strong enough to face the world when it refused to bend. He didn't change the cards he was dealt, he changed how he played them. The man who once blamed fate, friends, and failure, the man who ran from his reflection, had become someone who could stand in the storm and say, "Bring it on." Not because he was unbreakable, but because he had finally learned to show up for himself, no matter what. And in that unwavering presence, that was the true victory.